Hello, ladies, and a few good men. Welcome to the Autoimmune Rehab Podcast, where, as always, you can find all show notes and download and listen to other episodes at autoimmunerehab.com. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Leslie, who is a retired chiropractor and health coach, here with me. And we are going to be talking about a lot of things related to fibromyalgia. So, if you've ever wondered exactly what fibromyalgia is, why you potentially have it, how to potentially I don't know if I want to say cure it, but how to potentially make it so that it's less painful, then stay tuned because that's what we're going to share with you today. So, welcome to the show. Leslie, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and why I have you here today?
Well, great. And thank you. It's great to be here. So a little about myself. I was practicing chiropractor for about 30 years. And prior to that, I was actually a medical lab scientist. So I moved the past few years, I've moved into health coaching and consulting, which has given me the opportunity to kind of combine all of my skills, if you will, and help people in more ways. But the short and the long of it is that being a chiropractor for in the field for 30 years, I saw my share of fibromyalgia and my share of other autoimmune issues, and just whatever I can contribute to the betterment of everybody is what I'm here for.
That's awesome. So that's interesting that you started out more, I guess, in the traditional world, if you will, with the science and the labs and all that stuff. So the chemistry and that kind of thing, and then moved into holistic with becoming a chiropractor. Was there any particular reason or anything that in your life that kind of triggered that decision to say, okay, I don't want to do this scientific lab stuff anymore. Now I'm going to be a chiropractor?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There's always a story behind that one. Yeah. And the story is this: when I was just finishing up my qualifications to sit for my licensing exam as a medical lab scientist, one of the very last things that I had to do, I was doing an internship, and one of the very last things that I had to do was that I had to assist at the bedside for a bone marrow biopsy. And the little old lady, I later found out that the little old lady that they were doing this bone marrow biopsy on, there was no intention to ever actually do anything with this information or treat her. So, and it's just, for anyone that hasn't seen that kind of procedure, it's a horrible procedure. They can't use any kind of anesthetic for it. And they're basically getting bone marrow out of the bone. They have to penetrate the bone with a needle to get bone marrow out. And it's a very painful procedure. And they weren't going to be using the information that they got in the first place. So why were they doing that? And that was the epiphany that I had when I found this out.
Oh, wow, that's
And
interesting. Did you ever figure out what the rationale was? It was just basically we're doing this because we want to do scientific research, basically?
it was basically, we're doing this because this person she presented with a high white blood cell count, and she was in the hospital for a procedure that was unrelated to that, that they were going to do anyway, and they weren't going to treat her any differently. Whether she had it was basically to diagnose leukemia is what they were is why they were doing it. The thing is that chronic is that they were not intending on treating it in the first place. So why did they need the diagnosis?
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, but it's
And
pretty typical of our healthcare system, or sick care system rather, today.
exactly. And so the thing of it is that when I realized that, it was just like the light bulb went on. I was like, I can't in good consciousness contribute to this kind of thing. And then knowing where I was and knowing that any position I could ever hope to grow to from there, I knew that I could never have an effect on changing that paradigm. And so
Yeah.
yeah. So that, I ultimately did practice in the field for a few years while I was figuring out what else I wanted to do. But, the seed was planted, so to speak.
For sure, absolutely. And had you gone to a chiropractor before, and so you were thinking, okay, maybe I should pursue chiropractic, or was there any particular reasoning behind chiropractic specifically rather than, just jumping into health coaching or nutritionist or acupuncture or some other kind of holistic?
Well, health coaching was non-existent at that point in time.
Yeah.
We're talking about the late 70s, early 80s.
No, that's true. Yeah.
So no, health coaching was, was basically non-existent. Um, I actually vacillated between acupuncture and chiropractic for a number of years. And it wasn't ultimately until a couple of years later when and I had not been to a chiropractor. I had some acupuncture done. But it was ultimately a couple of years later when I went with a friend to her chiropractic appointment, and basically the chiropractor knew that I was thinking about going into chiropractic, and basically what he had to say to me was, he said, chiropractic comes from the philosophy that the body is self-healing and self-correcting, and that all we need to do is get the interference out of the way. I was like, well, that really spoke to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so it was at that point that I was like, I think I want to look into this a little bit more fully, and delved into it a little bit more, and eventually decided that was that was what I wanted to do.
Awesome, cool. So
Yeah.
now moving on to talking about fibromyalgia. There's a lot of, I guess, different definitions, even myths out there as to exactly what it is. How would you actually define fibromyalgia? And then along with that, how would you say, know that they actually have fibromyalgia?
Wow, that's how would I define fibromyalgia? That's Fibromyalgia, in all honesty, is one of those things that it's it's almost like a a garbage can diagnosis, if you will. It's like when they don't know what, you're presenting with pain, you're presenting with constant pain in a very typical pattern, but they really ultimately, they being the medical profession, really don't know as much about it as we would really like to. But what I've seen is that regardless of the diagnosis, we could have an effect on helping people's lives get better, and that's what matters.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's say somebody's listening to this and they've received that diagnosis of fibromyalgia, and maybe it's fairly recent, maybe it's not recent, but they're still really struggling with it. What would you say would be one or two key things that that person should do?
Okay. So from my perspective, it's very much diet and lifestyle related. And there are a lot of things going on there. There's the basic diet, there's the gut microbiome, there's, and there's lifestyle. If we can talk about those three things broadly and maybe narrow each of them down. So in terms of there's in terms of diet, what we seem to see mostly with fibromyalgia is that when we can get people off of dairy for sure, and often off of wheat as well, then they will have huge changes. And part of that also does involve the gut microbiome and healing the gut microbiome. And that's going to involve a lot, that's going to involve keeping that diet more on an anti-inflammatory perspective. So less animal foods, less oil, things of that nature, more fruits and veggies, more whole food, and probably a good, probiotic. And starting out there.
Yeah, for
And then,
sure. Absolutely. It's kind
yeah,
of like going back to the
yeah,
way our ancestors ate it. So I've seen these graphics circulating around saying that our great grandparents wouldn't recognize 80% of the food at the grocery store. So it's like, ask yourself if
exactly.
people of 200 years ago recognize this. And if the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't eat it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I tell my clients a lot. I say, walk into the grocery store, not like you're a modern human, but like you're somebody that's from the outback of Africa someplace, or Australia or South America, that's never, that's never seen a grocery store. What would you recognize there as real food? And buy from that perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that,
absolutely. I was actually just at the grocery store just a couple hours ago today, actually, because my local Kroger store has pineapples for 97 cents on sale. So I went to
oh,
get
nice.
some pineapples, and I'm out of avocados, and I'm a big avocado nut. So I went to get some avocados too. And while I was there, I was wandering around looking at a few things, taking pictures of food labels for a program that I'm going to be doing about how to read food labels. And some of what I found was just shocking. You just think, what?
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. It's, you know, you can open up, you can grab any package, and typically you're going to see a list of things that has colors and additives and preservatives and chemicals that you don't know what the heck they are. And your body wasn't designed for any of that stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, the
Yeah.
thing that kills it too is like canola oil and some of these seed oils. It's like one thing I found that looked really good was this package of pistachio nuts with Himalayan pink salt, but then of course they had to ruin it by putting canola oil in it. So you're just like,
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad that oils are one of the things that you mentioned, because what I tell people, I'm a really big whole food advocate. And I tell people, in terms of oil, is that if it's not an oil that you can basically get from your own kitchen, from the purified food, from the raw food, excuse me, then you probably should think twice about consuming it. So that would, interestingly enough, even include olive oil,
mm,
because I can take some peanuts or some almonds or things of that nature, and I can grind them, and I
mm,
can separate them and make, and get a little bit of oil from that. So I feel okay about using that. Now I do, all things being, in all honesty, I do occasionally use a little bit of olive oil. I do occasionally use a little bit of coconut oil, um, or a little bit of avocado oil. But, in terms of the seed oils, absolutely not. In terms of things of like corn oil or vegetable oil, absolutely not. Because,
yeah.
I just think about it in those terms. How much of any of that kind of stuff would you need to be able to purify that in your own? You can't purify that stuff on your own.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You can't. And the thing that people don't realize is a lot of those oils, especially like the canola oil, if you actually study on the history of it, it basically comes from a form of gasoline and paint and that kind of stuff. And it's like, what? You know? And you're going to put that in your body?
Well, I don't know that canola oil comes from paint, but I mean, it does come from, it does come from what's called the rapeseed plant. But rapeseed in and of itself is toxic.
Yeah.
And the only reason that it's not toxic to us now is because they have altered that seed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not toxic in the sense that you don't need to call poison control if you digest it, but
Yeah.
we could still say it's toxic in the
Yeah.
sense of not good for your inflammation and your immune
Yeah.
health and
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah, I think I think ultimately that's the thing is that all of these isolated oils do cause inflammation. And
Well,
what
absolutely, and they're so much cheaper, and that's why a lot of the food manufacturers use it. I mean, even
hmm
coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, those three you mentioned, they are significantly more expensive to
hmm
put in a food. So you make like potato chips that has avocado oil or something, it's going to cost more than the junk oils, corn oil, canola oil, all that stuff. And that's a big reason why
right,
the manufacturers don't do it, is because they're trying to save money and sell you a cheap product.
right. Because our government subsidizes canola oil
That too.
and soy oil and things of that nature. And that's the whole problem is that we have chosen to subsidize the wrong things. We should be subsidizing broccoli.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the thing people don't realize is that the government subsidizes a lot of dairy products and a lot of wheat crops and corn crops and all that stuff too. And
hmm
you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
We should be subsidizing broccoli and carrots and beans, and we shouldn't be
yeah,
subsidizing the junk stuff that nobody should be eating in the first place.
exactly. Yeah.
So, that's kind of just a little bit of my soapbox, and I'm sure it's yours as well. So, let's move on then a little bit and talk. Okay, so somebody's, they've got this fibromyalgia diagnosis, they've started working on it, they're working on changing their diet, working on healing their gut, all that kind of stuff. What other things would you say that somebody should take a look at if they've got this diagnosis? Like, maybe even additional tests? What other kinds of things would you think would be helpful?
I'm not really heavily into a lot of the testing because at the end of the day, what I see as more important is what's going to make a difference in your life. And getting out and getting regular activity is going to make a difference in your life. The more you start to do, the more you do today, the more you'll be able to do tomorrow. The more you do tomorrow, the more you'll be able to do the next day. So just the whole constant, excuse me, never ending improvement in that range, in that realm. So just start where you're at. But then the other thing that I would also look at in terms of just fibromyalgia and autoimmune in general is the rest of your environment and toxicity in other places and things like what are you putting on your skin, what are you breathing in, a lot of that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know when I switched to using more natural cleaners and quit using, the bleach and some of those heavy chemical loaded cleaners, the difference in my breathing and everything was just something else. I thought, whoa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And not just the difference in your breathing, but the difference in your overall energy level, the amount of toxins in your body and
Oh,
being, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like we don't realize it's the what we don't know that we don't know. It's like you're going along, you're doing life, and you don't realize how slowly your life is going downhill. And then all of a sudden you get all that stuff out of there, and you're like, wow, I never realized I could feel so good.
Absolutely. Well, but
Yeah.
for me, the reason I mentioned the breathing is that I was on asthma inhalers previously, and one of the things that got me off was not using those toxic chemicals for cleaning.
Ah,
And so for me,
yeah,
I definitely notice that it hits my lungs a lot if I
yeah,
am
yeah,
around those
yeah.
kind of toxins.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm pointing out is that it's not necessarily for that way for all people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
has a much bigger impact on you than people even realize. It's like,
exactly.
whoa. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about you. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, consider even working with you, how would they do that?
So, a couple of things. Probably the easiest place to get a hold of me and to see more of what I'm up to at the same time would be my Facebook group, which is called Vibrant Health Over 40.
Okay, awesome. Well, we will
Yeah,
include a link to that in the show notes so that anybody that wants to go check out that group can
yeah.
check it out. And anything else you want to add that we haven't talked about?
Um, let's see, I gave you that website. The other thing is that we were mentioning about all the toxins, and that very much ties into another passion of mine, which is all about hormone health, which everything that we've been talking about is all involved with your hormones anyway. And in that realm, I also do have a handout that I give to people called my 14 hormone hacks. So we could possibly put the URL to that in and let people get a hold of that as well.
Oh,
That would be,
absolutely. That would be great because I know
yeah,
that hormones being out of whack's a big problem, especially not that men don't have a challenge with it. I'm sure they do too, but women, especially for some reason, end up with an even bigger challenge with it.
yeah,
And, I know especially a lot of people with autoimmune issues, they have hormone issues too. Let's face
yeah.
it, you're interconnected.
Well, it all goes hand in hand because the autoimmunity is most often there's the whole leaky gut thing that's involved there, and that also involves the hormones, because that leaky gut is not allowing you to get the right hormones excreted in the right concentrations. Basically, is what it boils down to.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Awesome. Okay, well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me. So if you're listening to this, go ahead, check out our Facebook group. And like I said, we'll include the link to that download to help you out with your hormones. And thanks for listening. And we will share again with you next week in another episode of the Autoimmune Rehab Podcast.